The year was 1887, and the quietude of the high plains was almost a living entity. For 14-year-old Dravyn McRavane, it was the sole companion that remained. It had taken up residence in the log cabin the day his father's coughing finally ceased, and it had grown into a permanent fixture when his mother succumbed to a grief that had consumed her from within a winter later. Now, the silence was his legacy, as real as the deed to the 160 acres of unforgiving land that encircled him. His existence had narrowed down to the scope of his tasks: chopping wood, inspecting his traps, maintaining the modest garden, and gazing at a horizon that offered nothing but more of the same. Dravyn was slight for his age, lean and resilient, in the manner of things that have learned to yield rather than shatter. His face was a constant study in stoicism, his blue eyes holding a vigilance that belonged to a much older soul. He seldom spoke, having no one to address, and the sound of his own voice often surprised him when he spoke to the stubborn mule or cursed a rusty hinge. The world had shown him that survival was a quiet, solitary endeavor. Feelings were a luxury, a burden you couldn't afford to bear when every ounce of your strength was needed just to greet the next dawn. His sorrow for his parents was a weight he carried in his gut, cold and heavy, a thing he never acknowledged but never forgot. He existed in a state of controlled desperation, his routines a bulwark against the vast, oppressive loneliness of his life. He prepared his sparse meals, mended his worn clothes, and read the same 3 books his mother had treasured: a Bible, a collection of poems, and a worn primer, until the words were more familiar than his own reflection. The homestead was an island in a sea of grass, the nearest town, Harmony Creek, a 2-day journey away, and he had no reason to venture there. The townsfolk knew his story. They saw him as an unfortunate afterthought, the orphan boy clinging to a futile endeavor. Their pity felt more cutting than their disdain, so he kept his distance, embracing the isolation that had been forced upon him. He was a specter haunting the fringes of his own life, a boy trapped in the amber of his loss. One evening, as the sky darkened into the deep purples and oranges of twilight, a storm swept in from the west. It arrived without warning, a dark wall of clouds that engulfed the mountains and raced across the plains. The wind rose to a howl, a roar and mournful sound that seemed to rip at the very foundations of the cabin. Dravyn had just finished securing the mule in its lean-to and was fighting his way back to the door when he spotted a figure crumpled near the creek bed, nearly hidden in the whipping grass and gathering darkness. Caution was a lesson drilled into him by his father. Out here, the unexpected was rarely a friend. It could be a predator, or worse, a man with ill intentions. He pressed himself flat against a rocky outcrop, his heart pounding wildly in his chest, and strained to see through the rain-soaked air. It wasn't an animal. It was a human figure, small and motionless. He observed her for a long moment, the rain soaking his hair and sticking it to his forehead, his mind racing through various grim scenarios. Then a bolt of lightning briefly lit up the scene, and he recognized the dark braids, the buckskin dress, and the unmistakable features. It was a native woman. Every frightening tale he had ever heard in Harmony Creek flooded back, stories of raids, bitter land disputes, and a people who had every reason to resent settlers like him. His father had been an exception. He had spoken of the Cheyenne with respect, trading with them honestly and advocating for a peace that few others seemed to desire, but his father was no longer there. To assist her would invite trouble he was not prepared to face. To leave her would mean allowing the storm and whatever had befallen her to finish her off. He saw her move slightly, a faint, weak gesture, a hand clutching at her side. Even from his distance he could see the dark stain spreading on her dress. The weight of sorrow in his stomach seemed to shift. He thought of his mother, her body growing colder in her bed, as he had watched, helpless. He had been a boy then, powerless. He was still a boy now, but this was different. This was a choice. The wind wailed like a grieving creature, and in its cry, Dravyn made his decision. He stood up and ran, not towards the safety of his cabin, but towards the fallen stranger. She was younger than he had initially thought, perhaps only a few years older than himself. Her face, striking and angular, was pale beneath its copper hue, her lips tinged with blue. Her leg was bent at an unnatural angle, the bone clearly broken, and a deep, ragged gash in her side was bleeding slowly. Her eyes flickered open as he knelt beside her, dark and filled with a mix of pain and fierce, defiant mistrust. She recoiled as he reached for her, a low sound of warning in her throat. "I won't hurt you," Dravyn said, his voice hoarse and rough. The words felt strange on his tongue. "You will die out here." He didn't know if she understood his words, but she must have sensed the urgency in his voice. He was awkward and unskilled, but surprisingly strong from years of hard work. He looped her arm over his shoulders, his own slight frame struggling under her weight, and half dragged, half carried her through the pouring rain towards the dim lamplight of his cabin. The door slammed shut behind them, sealing them inside, two solitary figures from warring worlds, united by a storm and the harsh reality of an injury. Inside, the warmth of the small hearth was a sharp contrast to the chaos outside. He carefully lowered her onto the cot that had once belonged to his mother, his hands trembling slightly. Her gaze followed his every movement, sharp and evaluating, even through the fog of her pain. He noticed her gaze darting to the rifle hanging above the fireplace, then to the axe leaning against the wood pile, and finally to the lock on the door. He realized he was seen as a potential threat, an adversary. He chose to turn his back on her, a conscious display of trust he couldn't afford, but chose to extend. He tended to the fire, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He fetched water from the rain barrel and brought it to her, along with clean strips of cloth, torn from an old linen sheet of his mother's. He knelt beside the cot, placed the basin on the floor, and looked at her, his eyes asking a silent question. For a long moment she just stared, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Then, with a barely noticeable nod, she gave her consent. His hands, though rough and calloused, were surprisingly gentle as he worked. His knowledge of healing was limited to what he had learned from tending to farm animals, but he knew a clean wound had a better chance of healing than a dirty one. He carefully cut away the blood-soaked buckskin around her side, revealing a deep gash in her flesh, likely from the horn of a startled buffalo or elk. He cleaned it as best he could, his brow furrowed in concentration. She endured the pain with a stoicism that humbled him. Her only signs of distress were a tightening of her jaw and the clenching of her fists in the thin blanket. He could do nothing for her broken leg except splint it with makeshift supports made from floorboards, his efforts clumsy but sincere. When he finished, he covered her with his thickest wool blanket and retreated to a stool by the fire, leaving her to the solitude of her pain. For hours, the only sounds were the crackling of the fire, the steady drumming of rain on the roof, and her soft, pained breathing. He didn't sleep. He kept watch over her, a self-appointed protector in the midst of the storm. He saw the tension slowly leave her body as exhaustion claimed her. He noticed the hard line of her mouth soften slightly in her restless sleep. He didn't know her name or her story, but in the confined space of the cabin, she was no longer just an abstract danger or a political figure. She was a person, hurt and vulnerable, and he was the only barrier between her and death. A peculiar sense of purpose began to fill the emptiness within him. It was a feeling so unfamiliar he barely recognized it. It felt like warmth. It was well after midnight when a new sound joined the symphony of the storm. It started as a distant, mournful howl, but it was answered by another, and then another, closer this time. His blood turned to ice. He recognized that sound as well as he knew his own name. Wolves. The storm must have driven them down from the high country, and the scent of blood from the woman's wound was a beacon calling them across the prairie. The woman, whose name he would later discover was Sylvara, stirred on the cot, her eyes wide with a new terror that overshadowed her pain. She whispered a single word in her native tongue, a word that needed no translation. He moved swiftly, his own fear a cold knot in his stomach. He secured the bar across the door, pushing it firmly into place. He shoved the sturdy trestle table against it, adding an extra layer of defense. He examined the lone window, its shutters aged and worn by the elements. It was the most vulnerable spot. The howling intensified, encircling the cabin. It wasn't the sound of a single creature or a pair, but a pack. They were ravenous and fearless. He could hear the scrape of their claws on the log walls, the snuffling and whining as they probed the foundation for any opening, any weakness. He seized the heavy iron poker from the hearth, its tip still faintly glowing. It wasn't a formidable weapon, but it was the best he could manage within the confines of the cabin. The rifle was too slow to reload and useless against multiple fast-moving targets. A sudden, violent impact came from the window. A heavy body crashed against the shutter, causing the wood to creak in protest. Then, a snout, dark and damp, pushed through a crack, teeth snapping at the air. Dravyn lunged, thrusting the poker into the gap. The wolf yelped in pain and fury, retreating with the scent of singed fur. But the attack was far from over. Another wolf hurled itself at the door, its weight causing the thick wood to tremble. They were relentless, a shadowy wave of hunger and instinct. Dravyn moved like a trapped animal himself, darting from the door to the window, his mind racing. He needed to strengthen the shutter. The woodpile was his only source of material. Taking a deep breath, he unbarred the door, planning to be out and back in mere seconds. It was a reckless, desperate move. The instant the door creaked open, a gray shadow lunged from the darkness. Dravyn had no time to think, only to react. He threw his left arm up to protect his throat, and searing, white-hot pain exploded from his forearm as teeth sank deep into the muscle. He cried out, a sound of shock and agony, and kicked out with all his strength, connecting with the wolf's ribs. The animal released him, and he scrambled back inside, slamming the door and securing the bar, his arm throbbing in protest. He leaned against the door, panting, the warm wetness of his own blood running down his arm and dripping onto the floorboards. That was the first bite. Sylvara pushed herself up on one elbow, her eyes locked on him, her expression a mix of horror and awe. Through the pain, Dravyn felt a grim determination take root within him. They would not breach the cabin. They would not reach her. The wolves grew more frenzied, emboldened by the scent of his blood. They began to tear at the chinking between the logs near the base of the cabin. Dravyn grabbed a kettle of boiling water from the hearth and poured it through the gaps, rewarded by a chorus of pained yelps. It was a brief respite. As he was distracted, A wolf managed to dislodge a board from the bottom of the door. A paw, then a head, began to push its way through. 502 Bad Gateway. Unable to reach the origin service. The service may be down, or it may not be responding to traffic from Cloudflared. Its fangs scraped against his side, ripping through his shirt and flesh. The sixth attack. The cabin was a whirlwind of chaos, with the stool toppled and embers from the hearth strewn about. Dravyn was fueled by sheer determination, his legs threatening to give way. He knew his strength was waning. He had to finish it. He managed to steady himself, positioning between the wolf and Sylvara. The alpha wolf coiled itself, preparing for the final lethal leap. Dravyn gripped the axe, his knuckles pale. As the wolf pounced, he struck not at its head, but at its front paws, using a lumberjack's tactic for felling a tree. The axe made contact with a gruesome crunch of bone. The wolf crumpled, its front legs shattered, but its momentum propelled it forward. In its final, agonizing convulsion, it lunged one last time, its jaws clamping onto his already injured thigh with all its remaining force. The seventh bite. A primal scream tore from Dravyn's throat, raw and shattered. The pain was overwhelming, a blinding light that engulfed everything. The wolf went limp, its blood pooling on the floorboards beside his own. The cabin fell silent except for his ragged breaths. He stood unsteady for a moment, the heavy axe slipping from his numb hands. He looked at Sylvara, saw her wide, tear-filled eyes, and then the world spun and faded into a welcoming darkness. He crumpled to the floor, a boy who had held back the storm and been swept away in the process. The first light of dawn was a faint, watery glow filtering through the dirt and broken wood of the window. It revealed a scene of complete destruction. The body of the massive wolf lay cooling on the floor. The cabin was in disarray, its meager furniture overturned, the floorboards slick with blood. On the cot, Sylvara was alive, weak but awake. On the floor, barely breathing, lay Dravyn. He was a wreck of a boy, his clothes torn, his body a map of brutal wounds. The bleeding had mostly stopped, but his skin was an eerie white, his breath a faint, almost imperceptible whisper. Sylvara had spent the last hours drifting in and out of consciousness, her own pain a distant echo compared to the storm of violence she had witnessed. She had seen the quiet, unassuming boy transform into a being of unyielding ferocity. She had watched him endure wound after wound, refusing to yield, his body a living barrier between her and the pack. Now, in the quiet aftermath, a deep, aching gratitude filled her, so intense it was almost a physical pain. She tried to move, to crawl to him, but her broken leg and her own weakness kept her confined to the cot. All she could do was watch him, her tears carving clean paths through the dirt on her cheeks, and pray to the spirits of her people that he would not die. It was then that she heard the sound of approaching horses. Her heart surged with a mix of hope and dread. Hope that it was her people, dread for what they would see, what they would think. A band of Cheyenne warriors, guided by my father, the war chief Thrylos, reached the summit of a modest hill that overlooked the cabin. They had been pursuing me since I had not returned from my solitary expedition the previous day. Their search had intensified as the storm had rolled in. They spotted the cabin, a foreign structure on their ancestral grounds, and their expressions turned stern. They noticed the signs of the wolf pack, the tracks, the blood in the mud, and their faces grew even more somber. They dismounted, moving with the silent, fluid grace of men who had been born and raised on this land. Thrylos raised a hand, and his warriors spread out, their weapons at the ready. They advanced toward the cabin as if it were a fortified enemy stronghold. The door was ajar. Thrylos pushed it open and entered, his eyes scanning the entire scene in an instant. In a single, sweeping glance, he saw me alive, and relief mingled with fury on his stoic face. Then he noticed the lifeless form of the alpha wolf, its power and size still evident even in death. He took in the state of the cabin, the clear signs of a desperate, prolonged struggle, and finally his gaze fell upon the small, motionless figure of the white boy on the floor. His eyes narrowed. The most apparent conclusion was also the most unpleasant, that the boy had harmed me, and the wolves had been drawn by the conflict. But I cried out, my voice weak but clear. "Father," I said in the Cheyenne tongue. "No. He saved me." Thrylos' head whipped toward me. His warriors crowded in the doorway behind him, murmuring in confusion. The tribe's oldest tracker, a man named Hanya Haka, stepped past his chief and knelt, not by the boy but by the scene itself. His wise old eyes read the story written in blood and chaos. He pointed to the bite marks on Dravyn's arms, his legs, his shoulder. He indicated the way the boy's body lay protectively between the cot and the dead wolf. He pointed to the bloody axe near Dravyn's hand. He spoke in a low, reverent voice. "The boy did not fight the wolves to save himself," Hanya Haka declared, his voice carrying the weight of certainty. "He fought them to save me. He is bitten not once, but many times. He stood his ground all night. This child has the heart of a badger who will fight a mountain lion to protect its den." Thrylos looked from the tracker to me and then back to the boy. He walked over and knelt, his knees cracking with a gentleness that belied his fearsome reputation. He brushed the blood-matted hair from Dravyn's forehead. He saw the youth of him, the pallor of near death on his face. He saw the 7 distinct, grievous wounds, each one a testament to an act of courage so profound it defied the divisions of our peoples. This was not an enemy. This was a warrior in the truest sense of the word. A silence fell over the cabin, deeper and more meaningful than the lonely silence Dravyn had lived in for so long. It was a silence of respect, of awe. Thrylos looked at me, and in my eyes, he saw the truth of the tracker's words. He had arrived, prepared to either find his daughter missing or to seek retribution. Instead, he encountered a marvel. He faced his warriors and delivered a set of hushed, resolute orders. A couple of the fighters crafted a makeshift stretcher using blankets and spear handles for Sylvara. Sylvara himself scooped Dravyn up into his embrace. The boy was astonishingly frail, a collection of sticks and boundless bravery. He cradled him with the same care he would his own child, his touch a wordless regret for his earlier mistrust, a solemn vow of a debt to be repaid. They bore them out of the ravaged hut and into the pure morning sun. The entire tribe, who had been standing by at a distance, watched as their leader emerged, bearing not his daughter but an injured white youth. A murmur of bewilderment spread through them, but it was silenced by Thrylos' commanding stare. They laid Sylvara on a travois, and her mother hurried to her, tears of joy streaming down her face. Ignarion climbed onto his own steed, positioning Dravyn's lifeless form in front of him, holding him close to his chest. He was no longer Dravyn McRavane, the abandoned orphan of the plains. He was now a responsibility of the Cheyenne, a boy who had shed blood to shield one of their own, and who would now be safeguarded by every single one of them. As the procession commenced the gradual, cautious trek back to their settlement, Dravyn stirred, his eyelids flickering briefly, his unfocused gaze meeting Thrylos'. He saw no malice, no fury. He saw only a profound, intense gratitude and a respect that felt more like a haven than anything he had ever experienced. Then his eyes shut once more, and he drifted back into the restorative darkness, carried away from the quiet of his past and toward the noise of a future he could never have envisioned. If this story touched you, give it a like and tell us in the comments. What would you have done if you were in their shoes? Subscribe to Frontier Stories and join us as we continue to tell stories of hope, resilience, and the beautiful, messy truth of Wild West.